Laughter burst through the wooden barracks of Camp Swift, Texas. In the late summer of 1943, German prisoners of war had just been handed their evening rations, and among the bread, soup, and coffee sat a jar of something they had never seen before. The color was unappealing, the texture strange, almost crude. A thick brown paste clung stubbornly to the spoon. Major Ernst Vogel, once of the Afrika Korps, lifted it high with disdain. He tilted his head back and barked a laugh that rolled across the long wooden tables. "This," he scoffed, waving the spoon for all to see, "is food for pigs, not for soldiers of the Reich." The men around him erupted in raucous laughter. Some slapped their thighs, others pounded the tables. And soon the barracks roared with ridicule. The strange American concoction was mocked as a childish spread, something fit for toddlers, not for warriors. One prisoner shouted, "Do they want us to smear it on the walls?" Another quipped, "Perhaps it is glue, not food." Even the guards glanced over, puzzled at first by the commotion, then realizing the joke. The sound of laughter was not rare in prisoner of war camps, but this moment was different. It was born not from joy, but from arrogance, from the pride of men who still believed in the superiority of their culture, their food, their nation. Their derision was not really about peanut butter. It was about holding on to dignity in the face of captivity. And yet, in that laughter, the seeds of a silent reversal were already being sown. The camera lingers on the jar itself. The sticky surface gleams under a single hanging bulb, casting odd shadows on the rough table. The viewer sees what the prisoners cannot, that this jar is not merely a curiosity but a symbol. In its thick, sweet-smelling mass lies the story of industrial power, of abundance, and of a quiet defeat deeper than any battlefield. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And I invite you to share your location and the time where you are watching right now, so that across continents and hours, we may all sit together with this story of war, irony, and humanity. The laughter lingers a moment too long, echoing in the rafters. It is laughter that dares the world to prove them wrong. The laughter of that first night gave way to boasts that filled the barracks for days. Around every table, the prisoners reminded one another of what they had left behind, holding up the culinary traditions of Germany as a banner of superiority. Heavy loaves of dense rye bread, dark and hearty, spread thick with butter churned in alpine dairies, smoked sausages, the pride of Bavaria, packed with spice and strength, wheels of cheese aging in cool cellars. To them, this was food for men of discipline, food that gave muscles to soldiers and endurance to workers. Captain Wilhelm Kruger, a schoolteacher before the war, leaned back against the rough barrack wall and declared loudly enough for 2 tables to hear, "We Germans eat for power. Americans eat for pleasure, like children with sweets." A wave of approving nods passed through the room. In his voice was more than pride. It was a shield, a way to reclaim dignity after months of defeat in North Africa and the humiliation of transport across the ocean. The comparison became a ritual. Each time peanut butter reappeared on the table, the men recited their list of proud foods. As though reciting liturgy, they mocked the sticky paste by holding it up against the memory of black bread that could last weeks, of sausages smoked until they crackled with flavor, of butter churned thick enough to spread across 3 generations of a family farm. These images were not just about taste, they were about homeland, about identity. Yet outside the camp's barbed wire, the contrast was sharper than they could bear to imagine. Germany in 1943 was already rationing bread, cutting meat allocations, diluting butter with substitutes. Women queued in long lines for meager portions, and children often went to bed hungry. Meanwhile, the United States harvested peanuts by the millions of tons, and factories ground them into spreads so common that even children's lunchboxes carried them daily. Inside the barracks, however, ignorance was armor. They clung to their vision of German culinary strength because it gave them something to hold against the humiliation of being fed by their enemy. The joke was repeated so often it began to sound rehearsed. Peanut butter, one man would sneer, the American's idea of fine cuisine. Laughter followed, not because it was truly funny, but because it filled the silence of doubt. The part closes with a single image, a row of tin plates, each smeared with brown streaks of untouched spread. left to harden in the evening air. The prisoners thought they were rejecting weakness. They could not know they were rejecting a glimpse of a power that dwarfed their homeland's pride. The night was humid, the air inside the barracks heavy with the mingled scents of damp wood and boiled cabbage. By then, the laughter had quieted. The peanut butter jar still sat in the middle of one table, half full, its lid slightly askew, as if daring someone to break the unspoken pact of ridicule. The guards had long since left, their boots echoing down the corridor, leaving the prisoners alone with their thoughts. It was then that curiosity broke through pride. A young soldier, barely 20, his name recorded later as Private Karl Metzger, reached out with his finger. He glanced around nervously, as though committing a crime. The others leaned in, their smirks ready. He dipped lightly into the paste, lifted it to his lips, and touched it to his tongue. The change was instant. His eyes widened, his breath caught. What had looked crude and strange revealed itself as something rich, layered, almost indulgent, a strange balance of salt and sweetness, a density that melted slowly against his palate. He swallowed once, then said nothing. His silence was louder than any boast. The room shifted, jokes died on lips. The prisoners leaned forward, their curiosity colliding with their pride. One muttered, "Well, speak." But Karl only shrugged, eyes still on the jar, his posture giving away what his words would not. He wanted more. The camera follows his hand as he sets the jar down, pushing it gently toward the center of the table. Another man, Sergeant Otto Weiss, hardened from years in the Wehrmacht, raised an eyebrow, then dipped his spoon. He tasted, and for a brief moment, even he who had fought at Tobruk and cursed every American ration closed his eyes as though savoring something forbidden. The silence spread like a ripple. The laughter of the first night had collapsed into something new, a fragile recognition that what they had mocked was not a child's food, nor animal fodder, but something that stirred a hidden appetite. A few prisoners still snorted, arms crossed, muttering about German sausages and Bavarian beer, yet their voices were thin now, drowned beneath the sound of quiet spoons scraping against the jar. In a corner of the barracks, a diary entry was scrawled that evening by Corporal Heinrich Albers. He wrote that the American paste tastes odd but not unpleasant. I laughed yesterday, but today I am not laughing. Those words, smuggled decades later into archives, marked the exact moment pride gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to surrender. The part closes with an image of the jar itself, the spoon resting inside, tilted slightly, as though waiting for the next hand. The silence of the barracks speaks louder than their mocking had ever done. By the end of that week, the mockery had disappeared. What had begun as a joke turned into a quiet craving, then into a hunger that stirred quarrels in the dim light of the barracks. The jars arrived on the supply carts like any other ration. Yet now they carried a weight far greater than bread or soup. Men who once sneered now waited with nervous eyes, wondering if there would be enough to go around. Private Karl Metzger, the first to taste, became the object of envy. Fellow prisoners whispered that he always managed to get the first spoonful, that he had hidden a small tin somewhere under his bedding. Others claimed he had bribed a guard with sketches he drew of camp life, exchanging art for extra scoops of peanut butter, whether true or not. The gossip itself was proof of how obsession had taken hold. One night, Sergeant Otto Weiss tucked a spoon up his sleeve, waiting for the moment when the guards turned their backs. He scooped in silence, slipped the spoon quickly into his mouth, and returned it to hiding, his face hard but his eyes betraying the secret pleasure around him. Others watched, pretending not to notice, because to admit the craving was to admit weakness. Yet soon, secrecy failed. The climax came when two men, Hans Bauer and Friedrich Klein, grappled over a half-empty jar in full view of their comrades. Their struggle was clumsy, fueled less by true violence than by desperation. The jar toppled, the lid clattering onto the wooden floor with a metallic echo that silenced the barracks. For a moment, both men froze, staring at the precious paste smeared across their hands. Then, almost absurdly, they licked their fingers clean. The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in a stunned recognition of how far they had fallen from pride. That night, Corporal Heinrich Albers wrote again in his diary, "What we ridiculed yesterday, we now fight for strange. How quickly the mouth betrays the pride of the mind." His words capture the transformation better than any statistic. Yet numbers tell the story too. In 1943 alone, American factories produced more than 200 million pounds of peanut butter, enough to supply every soldier, every child, and even every prisoner, for men from a land where families survived on thin slices of black bread. The scale was incomprehensible. The part closes on a symbolic image, a jar, its sides scraped thin, sits abandoned in the lamplight. Around it, silent faces stare, not at the guards, not at their comrades, but at the jar itself, as if it had become a mirror, reflecting both their hunger and their surrender. The peanut butter jar, once a target of ridicule, had become something far greater than food. It was a mirror reflecting the staggering plenty of the United States, a nation that could feed its people and its prisoners with an ease that defied European imagination. For men who came from a Germany tightening its ration cards year by year, this jar represented a revelation. By 1944, American peanut harvests topped more than 1.6 million tons, and factories churned out hundreds of millions of pounds of peanut butter. It was no longer a luxury, it was an everyday staple. Spread on schoolchildren's sandwiches, packed into soldiers' rations, even shipped overseas to allies. What to a German prisoner seemed exotic and strange was, in fact, as ordinary in America as salt or flour in the barracks. These facts cut deeper than any lecture about democracy or freedom. Lieutenant Franz Schaefer, once proud of his family's butcher shop in Cologne, could not believe what he saw. In Germany, he muttered, we hide what little sausage we have from our neighbors. Here, they feed us this, and even their children eat it without thought. His bitterness was real, but beneath it lay awe. The generational divide soon appeared. Older officers scoffed at the spread, dismissing it as peasant fare unworthy of serious men. They clung to their disdain as a last defense against humiliation. But the younger prisoners no longer mocked. They waited eagerly for the jars, scraping every last streak with crusts of bread. The contrast was not just about taste, it was about the collapse of one worldview and the birth of another. A gossip ran through the camp that one American guard joked, "Back home, my boy leaves half his sandwich uneaten." The POWs whispered it with disbelief, children throwing away what grown men now fought to taste. It was a story that struck them harder than bombings or propaganda. It revealed a truth they could not ignore. America's abundance was so vast that waste itself was a casual act. One evening, Captain Wilhelm Kruger tried to rally the men with his old refrain, "We Germans eat for strength, Americans eat for pleasure," but his words hung hollow. A murmur passed through the barracks. Younger men exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. The phrase no longer fit what they were living. And so the jar became not just a ration, but a silent teacher. It told of factories running night and day, of endless fields in the south, of conveyor belts that never stopped. It told of a nation that could afford to feed its captives as though they were guests. That lesson was bitter and sweet all at once. I want to pause here and ask you, the audience, if you had been in that camp, with your pride and hunger pulling you in opposite directions, what would you have done? Would you have rejected the jar or scraped it clean? Share your thoughts in the comments. I am curious to hear where you stand. The part closes with the sound of a train whistle in the distance, carrying more food into the American heartland, inside the barracks. A half-empty jar sits quietly, proof that even in captivity, abundance could change the shape of pride. The jars no longer caused arguments alone. They began to create moments that no one had expected, moments when the enemy's food became a bridge between guards and prisoners. In the sharp contrast of war, the smallest kindness carried enormous weight. One afternoon in early spring of 1944, the ration carts rolled into Camp Aliceville, Alabama. An American guard, Private James McAllister, noticed the way the prisoners eyed the peanut butter jar. Instead of tossing it onto the table without thought, he placed it carefully beside the bread. Then, almost casually, he added, "Eat. You'll get used to it." His words were simple, not intended as a grand gesture, yet to the prisoners, it felt like an invitation to share in something familiar, almost domestic. For a brief second, the lines of war blurred. Some POWs remained stiff, refusing to show weakness. Others, however, could not hide the flicker of gratitude. Corporal Heinrich Albers, the diary writer, noted that day. The guard smiled as though we were men, not enemies, and when I tasted the bread with the paste, it was not bitterness, but warmth that filled me. Such small moments were never reported in official records, but they left lasting imprints on the men who lived them. Peanut butter, sticky and sweet, became part of their routines. Some spread it thin on bread, others stirred it into morning coffee, while a few ate it straight from the spoon in secret indulgence. What had been mocked as glue or pig fodder now became the highlight of the day. And with each jar shared, suspicion thinned, like fog burned away by sunlight. The Americans, too, noticed the change. Guards who once viewed the prisoners with suspicion saw them smile faintly, even laugh softly. Over their food, a sergeant remarked in passing that peanut butter had done more to calm the camp than a dozen rules. It was not a grand victory of ideology, nor a surrender on the battlefield. It was something quieter, more human. In one symbolic scene, a guard handed a slice of bread smeared with peanut butter to a prisoner without a word. The man hesitated, then took it, nodding once in thanks, behind barbed wire. This exchange had the weight of a treaty. Food, at that moment, was no longer just sustenance, it was a bridge, fragile but real. And so a paradox emerged. The very spread that revealed America's power also revealed America's humanity. It was abundance not only as strength, but as generosity. The jars had become an unspoken language, teaching lessons that no lecture could deliver. I want to turn this to you, the audience. Do you think kindness and small gestures, like sharing food, can change a person's beliefs more than speeches or propaganda ever could? Share your view. I want to hear if you believe in the power of the ordinary to reshape the human heart. The part closes with a soft image in the fading evening light. A spoon rests on an empty jar, sticky traces catching the glow of the lantern. Around it, silence, yet also a fragile peace. The war ended, but the taste lingered. For many German prisoners, the memory of peanut butter traveled with them across the ocean, long after the gates of American camps swung open. What had begun as ridicule became an obsession, and finally, a symbol that endured for decades. In 1946, as repatriation ships carried thousands of POWs back to Europe, some men tried to smuggle jars into their packs. Guards laughed when they discovered the contraband, astonished that hardened veterans clung to what once made them scoff. Letters written years later reveal that a few succeeded, carrying home their first jars of peanut butter like trophies, not of conquest, but of surrender to a new taste and a new idea of abundance. Private Karl Metzger, whose curiosity had broken the silence of ridicule, told his daughter in the 1970s that the first spoonful haunted him more vividly than any battlefield. We had mocked it, he admitted, and then we fought each other for it. That paste taught me more about America than its tanks. His words capture the strange alchemy of that food, how something so small could unmake pride, soften arrogance, and plant a seed of admiration. The memory spread in unexpected ways. In post-war Germany, American peanut butter appeared in black market stalls, sold at shocking prices to curious civilians. Some former POWs sought it out immediately, eager to taste again the spread that had become part of their survival. For them, the jar was no longer foreign. It was a reminder of humanity glimpsed in captivity. One anecdote survives from the 1980s. A former prisoner, now a grandfather in Bremen, sat at his kitchen table with his grandson. He placed a jar of Skippy in front of the boy, scooped out a spoonful, and said quietly, "I once laughed at this. Then I could not live without it." The boy, wide-eyed, could not imagine his stern grandfather fighting over something so ordinary. Yet in that spoon, the old man saw more than food. He saw the collapse of an old world and the rise of another. The final image is simple but powerful. A spoon dipped in peanut butter glows under a kitchen lamp, just as it once gleamed under a barracks lantern in Caesar, Alabama. It is the same spoon, across time and continents, carrying the taste of defeat, of survival, and of unexpected kindness. A symbol that what men once despised could become what they cherished most. History often remembers wars in terms of victories and defeats, strategies and battles, generals and maps. Yet behind these sweeping arcs of destruction lie moments so small that they would seem trivial until we realize how they altered hearts. The story of German prisoners and peanut butter is one of those unlikely mirrors. It was not a battlefield or a speech that changed them, but the quiet shock of a taste that revealed a different world. For men raised in hunger and pride, the jar represented both humiliation and wonder. In its sticky sweetness, they confronted a truth they could not argue away, that America's power was not only in its factories or its armies, but in its capacity to turn abundance into something ordinary. Even its children lived with more than Germany's soldiers had ever known. This recognition shook foundations more deeply than propaganda could, because it was lived, swallowed, digested, and then, beyond the shock, came something gentler. A guard's smile as he handed over a slice of bread, a spoon passed across a table without words, laughter that turned into silence, and silence into gratitude. In those fleeting gestures, humanity re-emerged, fragile but undeniable. The peanut butter jar became a bridge, sticky and clumsy, yet strong enough to cross the chasm of war, decades later. The memory lingered, not because of flavor alone, but because it embodied a transformation. Men who mocked became men who remembered with longing. A symbol of defeat became a token of survival, and even of affection. Perhaps this is what history asks us to consider, that sometimes the greatest revolutions happen not with speeches or banners, but with the simplest of things placed on a table, a jar, a spoon, and a taste that turned enemies into men again.